Thanks very much for coming. It's really great to see so many people here on something about documentation, which isn't usually considered that sexy a thing, but it's I find it very interesting. Um, I am a technical author here at Canonical, but I've been writing about Linux and open source for 20 years. And when I was thinking about submitting something for the Ubuntu Summit, I was really just, I had a load of notes. They're not tips. It's more like documentation ideas that I have in mind as I'm writing. And I think one of the things that you do when writing is you have to find your own approach. You have to find a way that works for you. And it's going to be slightly different for everyone. But what I really want to do more than anything is advocate for documentation and for writing and for people to get started and for people to have the confidence in writing. Because I think that's often the hardest part. So these are literally my written notes, and 9 tips for better writing should be 9 tips to improve my handwriting because it's terrible. The later slides, actually, I put up the main points. But for me, 20 years ago, one of the first things I wrote and was paid for writing was a review in a Linux magazine of a proprietary piece of software called PKZip. It was really hard, I have to say. I mean, I hadn't written anything professionally before. I'd got the job because I'd been an open source developer. I'd written some open source software that was quite popular, and I actually enjoyed the communication. I was maybe better at the communication than I was at the programming, and it interested me. Writing 850 words on PKZip, I found very difficult. It took me a week. And like a new bike, like a new car, you don't want to go out and get it scratched. And I felt very much like that about putting my words down on paper and knowing that they were going to be published and then read by people. At the end of the day, you've got to get out and use it. You've got to just start writing. It's going to get dented. It's going to get scratched. You're going to find your own ways of working. And that's what I did. And I think that's what I'm trying to encourage everybody to do. And that's really what these 9 tips are about. They're not tips, and there's not 9 of them. So this is often the most important thing for me. I handle quite a lot of complicated technologies now, dealing with engineers. They work in very abstract terms, and trying to translate that in a way that I can't define, in a way that I don't know the reader, there's not one reader, takes time. And often I will be aware of something needing to be written, but I need to take a step back from the actual process of writing. And I find it easier to write a few things down and then go away, and then go out for a walk or go out for a ride or leave a weekend between the task and the starting to writing. And I think you shouldn't be afraid of letting something compose in your brain before starting and then starting it again. So that's what this one is about. And I think the right balance of this is personal. I do know people, brilliant writers, who will just start writing, and they're good at that, but that doesn't work for me. This isn't a peas in a pea pod. This is supposed to be a drawing of a circle, a vector, rasterized into pixels. The idea is that the ideas that you're trying to document are kind of like vector images in your head. And the process of putting them into words is a bit like rasterization, putting them into pixels. And there's an algorithm for drawing pixels from a circle, and you can do it in varying degrees of detail and depth. To start off with, you just need the crude outline. And then the more time you spend on it, the more time you iterate over it, the detail becomes more and more clear. And so it is about putting something down and then refining on it and even removing it in the end. There's a later point where I say documentation is a lot like code. And maybe it's because it's technical writing, but I think you can take that as far as you want to take it. Writing is like a programming language. The brain is a bit like a CPU in my mind, but it doesn't have a defined instruction set, and everybody's instruction set is different. And so you've got many of the same challenges, but then you've got big differences as well in the abstraction of that, how you interpret it for different CPUs and different brains and different backgrounds. And you've got to be careful as a writer to try and accommodate everything, without addressing a single person or making it too broad. Which really leads to simplicity is the most important thing, and it's possibly the hardest thing to do. It's even a difficult idea for me to communicate because you have to be the judge of what's simple. And usually it's people not complaining. But there's I thought about making musical equivalents to a lot of these points, and this is the only one I've actually got in. And although there's two there, there's David Byrne lyrics from Psycho Killer, but much better was Glenn Gould was an amazing pianist, and one of his best performances caught on record was his performance. He did two versions of this on record of Bach's Goldberg variations. He did one when he was a relatively young person in 1955, and his skill and virtuosity is incredible. The speed, I mean, sometimes Bach sounds like it's programmed, and listening to Glenn Gould perform this in 1955 is like a machine running through it. It's the virtuosity in the performance is incredible, but I don't really enjoy the performance. It's great he's showing off, and it's perhaps a verbatim copy of what Bach wanted. Many years, well, 26 years later, Glenn Gould did another version, another recording of the same piece of music. He's a lot older. He's got a lot more experience, and it's a lot slower, and there's a lot of time between the notes. There's a lot more consideration. There's a lot more variation in the timing. And I think as you improve in confidence as a writer, you start to find yourself introducing that. You've got more confidence in keeping things simple when you may want to show off with your language or your syntax. It's actually much better to just use ordinary words that everybody knows, people who are non-native speakers perhaps, or even target it for a child. I don't think I've kept it in, but I did think about it. Sometimes it's useful to think of it as file naming for old Windows machines where you had 8 characters, a dot, and then 3 characters. You know, technical writing can be a lot like that. How much information can you provide in a very simple way? This is a trade-off you can spend so I say it's iterative, but you can spend too long as well. So when you're writing something, you do all the writing, and then it helps, I think, to edit at the same time, deleting things, and never be afraid of deleting. But there becomes a point where you're editing more than you're writing, and that's probably the point where you should stop. Don't be afraid of stopping and going away and working on something that feels higher priority or is of more interest to you. If you got a sense of ownership over what you've written, and I think we all would, you want to go back. And when it passes a certain kind of threshold of wanting to fix something, you go back and fix it. Now, I have got a terrible memory, and I actually think this has really helped me with documentation, because the curse of knowledge is the idea that when you understand something, you can no longer approach a subject as a beginner. So I write the snap documentation, and I'm okay at building snaps. And it's sometimes difficult to put myself in the position of somebody who's completely new to snaps. What do they not understand, or do they not even know they don't know? And being forgetful is purposefully not remembering how you wrote something, or coming back to something after a couple of weeks that you've written and not remembering that you wrote it, and looking at it with a completely fresh set of eyes. I will often come across things that I've written that I didn't know I've written and want to change it, and that's the right feeling to have. And it can often help me to try and forcefully be forgetful, even though I have got this bad memory. And very similar to the first tip about stepping back and having perspective, going off and working on something else and coming back has always helped me. You can also get bored working on the same thing. That chart that I had with the editing and the writing, don't be afraid to leave anything. I like the way that we work, and that things get published and then you can go and work on something else. I've got like 170 tasks in my to-do list of things that need to be documented. And I think it's good to go off and do something else when you've got stuck in a rut and come back. It helps with the forgetfulness. So I don't try and do something for too long. it's difficult when there's YouTube and all those kind of things, but it can help to change to a different part of the documentation that you're working on. Or none of this is specific to technical documentation. I think it's the same for other kind of writing as well. I found it in the past when writing tutorials, you can work on different parts of a tutorial at the same time, and it's okay to switch to the part that interests you, because the imperative then becomes the parts that you've missed once things have hit a certain quality. And this is actually related to ideas needing a hook. I think that's my attempt to draw a virus or something. But if there's something that interests you, your writing is better. And if there's that perspective from writing the parts that you want to write about, but there's also the part that you know that other people are going to be interested in. And this might not be the best part that needs to be documented. You might have a requirement to document a load of API endpoints, and they're not the most interesting things to write about. But you can often find an element of an API endpoint that you do find interesting. It could be something that lights an LED on a Raspberry Pi. It could be configuring GPI opens in Snap. And it's always helped me to write about it, or even to experiment with it, to get something to work, and then write about that, because that's the hook. That's the hook for me to become committed to writing about it. I also think that's the hook for people wanting to read about it. And that's the most important thing, the people who are going to read about it. I don't know if that's what my next one. So I mentioned this before, but I often think I really think that documentation is a lot like code. There is a movement that publishes documentation as code, and I think it's a very powerful one, where documentation is developed through pull requests, usually with Git, with peer reviews. You get all the same benefits, the same kind of history. But as I was saying before, I think it also helps to think about brains as CPUs and words as like the syntax that you use to program ideas. And you can take this as far as you want to take the idea. And like code, it's easy to write something functional that works. And I found that in documentation, it can sometimes be easy to write the README for a project, for example, because there's a lot of ideas to cover. But then it's very difficult to take it from that initial functional template and then broaden that to be an actual set of documentation. But you have to find a way of doing it. You have to find a way of expanding on the things that you've already started. And it's a lot harder to write in an optimal way. And by that, I mean in a way that serves the purpose of the things that you're trying to write about. If we just talked about the hook and getting excited about it, that you then have to refine it so that people can understand what you're writing about without spending too much time. Writing is a position of privilege, and I think this is the infinite to one, but the writer is the colon. You're the interface between the developer, perhaps, and all the people who are trying to use the tool for however many reasons they're trying to use it. Then you can't imagine how many people use snaps in lots of different ways. But it's the same when you're writing for magazines and you write a tutorial or you write a cover feature. You've absolutely no idea how people are going to interpret that. So at the same time, you have to be broad and applicable to the audience, but also deep enough that even skilled people are going to get what they can from it. And that's really difficult. I don't have any answers to how to kind of solve these problems, because it goes back to the first issue of just getting started. You have to empathize with the reader. I think empathy is overused, and we talk about it in documentation a lot. But you are in the position of the reader, whoever they may be, and especially with technical writing and technical subjects, you're not always dealing with the most empathetic personalities or the most empathetic features. Features obviously come into being without any purpose for being empathetic or for the end user, although they should. I mean, I think technical authors should have a lot more say in user interface design and feature design. But for whatever reason, we find ourselves in the position of being the bridge between what something is and how other people need to use it. And I've found the best way of doing that, and I mean that's what open source and Linux is so great for, is you can actually play with the things that you're writing about. I've spoken to many technical authors or technical writers who work and people who work for NASA, for example, who write about NASA's hardware. They never get to use it. They have to write in a very abstract form. And it's the same in telecoms companies have 100 technical authors writing about APIs. They never get to test them. They never get to play with them. But that's something that we can do. It's something that you can do if you're documenting Linux technology, and it helps you understand how people are using something and how you can approach your documentation. Now, I had a lot on this, and I thought I was really I've had to cut it down. But this is, you can see the doctor's code thing is going through my head. But words are just a serial interface. It's one thing after the next after the next, and thoughts and features are often parallel. And you only have one opportunity when you're describing something and somebody's reading something for the first time. It depends on the kind of documentation it is. But you only have one opportunity to form an impression. And sometimes you have to make a compromise on a sober description of what a feature is and how you know somebody's going to interpret that feature or piece of documentation. And sometimes you have to make a compromise on saying exactly what it is you're writing about. I hope this is clear. And on what you actually want to describe the whole set of features. So one example would be snap refreshes. They by default, snaps don't, you can't stop snaps from being updated. But I've got to write the refresh documentation in a way that also describes the ability to hold an update. So postpone it, while at the same time as saying they can be refreshed. And those two ideas you have to kind of bring together in a serial line of text so that people can understand multiple things at the same time. That's difficult. So this is actually the last slide, and this is something that we're starting at Canonical. We've been hiring a lot of technical authors, and we've been doing a lot of interviews, and we've been reviewing a lot of applications for technical authors. And one thing we've noticed is that there are some fantastic writers who just don't have the experience or the commit history for us to be able to take them further. And also, I've noticed this in open source software in general. There's a lack of quality documentation because people perhaps lack the confidence to make those initial first steps or don't know what those initial first steps can be. So our idea behind the Open Documentation Academy is that through a few things. Firstly, we'd like to create a list of issues that we think are ideal for people to start working on, who may have never made any kind of commitment before, but also people who maybe want to try some more ambitious documentation work. We have a series of office hours where anybody in the world can kind of join these office hours, discuss the things that they'd like to get involved with in open source and our issues. We help people make those contributions, take on the tasks that they want to task, and land those contributions on those projects. I'd really like it to not be a canonical thing. I mean, I'm well placed to be able to, or we're all well placed at Canonical to be able to start this ourselves because there's a huge number of projects. There's a never-ending list of documentation tasks that need to be done. And now we have quite a cohort of technical authors to be able to spread the load of helping people make their contributions. But it would be wonderful if something like this could be broadened to the open source community as well, which is why I don't want to make it about Canonical specifically. But it seems to me like a great way to help people start contributing and gain their confidence in documentation. This URL is live. one thing we need to settle on this week, actually, in the week that's just following it, is the times for the office hours. We'd also like to do a podcast related to this. And also there's a forum, and we'd also like to set up some interactive chat. So none of that is quite set up yet, but by the end of this week, it should be ready to go. But I wanted to mention it. Actually, when I proposed this talk, we hadn't had the idea to do this yet, so it's actually fitted in quite well. Yeah, and that's it. I did want to leave some time for some questions. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them.
All right. Well, thanks for that. I really enjoyed especially the combination of the writing and the type on the slides. But I wanted to ask, on one of the slides, I'm forgetting which one it was, you had a note at the bottom that said, I believe it was linguistic virtuosity.
Oh yeah, the one with
equals Nolan's Tenet.
Yeah, so
I'm just really curious what what is your thought behind that?
Well, I think Christopher Nolan, I think, is an amazing film director. I really enjoy his films. I like the way there's multiple timelines interwoven with a lot of his films. But I don't know if anyone's seen Tenet. It's a story that basically moves in two directions at once. It moves from the end of the film back to the beginning of the film, and from the beginning of the film to the end of the film at the same time. It kind of meets in the middle and swaps. And I find that it's incredible filmmaking. I think he pulls it off, but it's too clever for its own good. And I think it's very difficult for people to simply enjoy the movie or to appreciate his idea, which probably could have been, he could have done with an editor or a better editor or someone who doesn't say it, in my opinion. So that's kind of what I mean. I think I mean that about linguistic virtuosity, about really cleverly constructed sentences that may say all you want to say, just like a line of code, line of Perl, let's say. Yeah, just like that. You can, you may as well expand something or write it in Python, and it's easier for other people to understand.
Thank
you. The hardest in documentation is keep it up to date, how you deal with it.
Yeah, maintenance is probably a bigger problem than writing. And I think we don't have an ideal solution for that. What you need to ensure that you have the resources, and if it's technical writing for a technical product, then it needs to be part of the development process. It needs to be tracked alongside software issues. There are lots of ways of doing it. I think the docs as code approach is a really good one, where when things change in the code, it's more obvious that you have to change the documentation if the documentation lives alongside the code. But I've seen other people set time limits on expiration dates on documentation that automatically create tickets for a review when something is a certain period of a certain age. But this also needs planning, because one of the problems, it's the same for developers as well, is you always seem to be working on a to-do list or putting out fires. So you have to persuade the people that have the power to allocate the time that maintenance is worth the time investment rather than. So that's perhaps the best place to start. Yeah.
You mentioned about putting yourself in the shoes of another person in order to describe your ideas better. How do you manage to do this when having deadlines, like having no time to shift to another project and after that going to another project, into the initial project? And a second question here, is there any open framework for maintainers to create their documentation, like a recommended structure or something like this?
So I think the first question is, there's only so much you can do. If you've got a time limit, it's a bit like I was talking about rasterizing the circle. It's never going to be a perfect circle, or it's only going to be pi to a certain level. And within the time that you've got, you've got to. I mean, with Linux, I think you just have to use the thing. If it's open source, you have to test it and put yourself in the position of somebody who's going to come at it fresh within your time limits. If you've got a week to write something, you've got to, and you know how complex it is. You might give yourself a day to play with it, but if you've got 6 months, one of the great things about working on the engineering teams that we do is that we're in the stand-ups with the engineers. We see the features as they evolve. So by the time the features land, we're in a good place to be able to understand what the intention was behind the documentation, but also understand how it's going to affect the users, and that helps. As for the framework, we use a variety of frameworks, Canonical. I haven't got a great recommendation. Sphinx and RST works okay. If you want a structure, then we use Dear Taxes, which is great for developers because it gives people a signpost of where they need to write documentation. And I find actually getting developers engaged in the documentation process is one of the most important parts, regardless of the ultimate endpoint of where the documentation lives. And I think we're out of time.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much.